The Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Pride Seeds, Cruiser Max Vibrance Beans, High Stick NT, and the Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Grower.
All right, we're joined by Dr. Don Flaten of the University of Manitoba here on Real Agriculture to talk about phosphorus management in soybeans. And Don, we know that soybeans take up a lot of phosphorus out of the soil, but at the same time don't show much response to P when it's applied with the seed. Mm-hmm. What does this mean for the way farmers should approach their meeting the nutrient requirements? Of soybeans growing in this part of the world?
Well, that's a good question, and a lot of soybean growers put on no phosphate or very low rates of phosphates with their soybeans, and so you compare the amount that's going on compared to the amount that's being harvested, and we've got a deficit of phosphorus during the soybean year. And what we're suggesting to farmers is that in order to maintain their overall pea fertility, which is very good for the other crops in the rotations like canola and wheat, and we want to encourage them to think about a rotational fertilization concept where if they look at the overall balance of phosphorus added compared to phosphorus removed for the full rotation, they're maintaining their pea fertility for the sake of the other crops in the rotation.
So it's a longer term approach.
That's right, because if you just focus on a year by year sort of situation or approach, you may find that your soil test P just keeps on going down, 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 down. That can start limiting yield, especially of the other crops that are more responsive to P, like canola and wheat.
So what are some of the strategies or options for making sure you don't deplete your phosphorus?
Well, we're promoting basically sort of three concepts. One is if you take advantage of the cereals like wheat and oats and barley and their capacity to tolerate high rates of seed row P, you can put 50 pounds of phosphate per acre without hurting your cereal crop. You maximize that seed row P in those cereal years, that can help compensate for the deficits in your soybean and canola years, for example. Another thing, putting on manure. A lot of people concerned about manure applying excess phosphorus when it's put on for the nitrogen sort of crop requirements, but you know what, that's a fantastic thing to do once every 4 years or 5 years. Put on manure, and that's just a fantastic way to raise your soil P levels. Another way is to look at side banding, mechanically applying the phosphate fertilizer beside the seed so you avoid the phosphorus toxicity risk. Even though in a situation like soybeans you might not get much response to that P, you're still maintaining your P fertility. That's good agronomically. It might also be part of a land rental agreement. A lot of land rental agreements now looking at phosphorus maintenance as one of the criteria or one of the clauses in those agreements.
Mm-hmm. Would it make sense to apply phosphorus in some form in fall?
Well, I think if you deep banded the phosphate in the fall, that might be good agronomically, but it would be especially good environmentally. Broadcast phosphate fallapplied has been well identified as a serious risk in terms of water quality problems because in snowmelt, a lot of that phosphate is at risk of running off, and we don't want to be environmentally irresponsible. We also don't want governments to intervene with a whole bunch of regulations on fertilizer applications. So we're not advocating a fall broadcast, but fall banded with a deep tiller and maybe an air kit to put phosphate down underneath the soil surface in the fall with a deep tiller. That's probably a great option to consider.
So long term, are we seeing this become a greater concern with more soybeans being grown in Manitoba and Western Canada?
Sure, like in some areas like northeast of Winnipeg, where we've had a very, very intensive sort of soybean production-oriented crop rotation, we've seen the proportion of fields testing low in phosphorus double from 1/3 of the acres to 2/3 of the acres. So I think it is a significant issue in intensive soybean areas.
So when you say low test phosphorus, what does that mean?
Well, that means that in technical terms that the Olsen test is extracting less than 10 part per million phosphorus. What it means in terms of a farmer agronomically is that probably the overall fertility of that soil is limiting canola and wheat and other crops because they need overall P fertility as well as P fertilizer to grow to an optimum yield.
So if your Olsen test is below 10, that's when you should be looking at finding
some way of building up. So what we see is sort of the sweet spot for soil test P is 10 to 20 part per million. If you're less than 10, you should probably looking for manure or other sources of P to build it up. If you're above 20, you can probably cut back to just a little bit of seed row P every year for starter in the early spring, and you can let your phosphorus level subside a little bit. But 10 to 20 part per million, that's sort of where we're aiming.
All right. Well, thanks for your time, Don.
Thank you.